Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining our webinar, Working on Water, Why Better Reporting is Needed. Today's event is being recorded and will be published on Planet Tracker's YouTube channel later. My name is Richard Wielechowski, and I'm the Senior Investment Analyst on the Textiles program at Planet Tracker. I'm delighted to be joined by Saba Dar, Manager of Water Stewardship from WWF, and Nathan Cole, Head of Sustainable Business from CDP. The agenda for today's webinar is that we'll start with a very brief set of slides from each of the panel, allowing them to talk about their areas of expertise and area of focus on water and textiles. We'll then move to a panel discussion. If you'd like to ask a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat function, and I'll aim to include as many as I can in our discussion. Those we don't get to, we will follow up on after the event via email. So if you've got any burning questions, please do put them in that Q&A function. With that, I will start the scene setting by discussing recent Planet Tracker work on water in the textiles industry. So for those of you who maybe don't know Planet Tracker, we are a non-profit sustainable finance think tank. We produce research on nature-related opportunities and risks. And our goal is really via our research and engagement to highlight the importance of nature and to capital markets and help them move to include sustainability in their investment decisions. I would also like to take this chance to thank the Global Commons Alliance Accountability Accelerator, who have funded the work we've been doing on water in recent months. So moving on to consider, why are we talking about water in the textile supply chain at all? Why are we hosting this webinar? Well, because it is fundamental to textile production. On this slide, we summarize some of the water dependencies and water impacts that we see in the manufacture and retail of apparel. And these range from the need for water to, say, irrigate fiber crops such as cotton, to water used for dyeing fabrics, to that water need for hygiene and washing by workforces. Now, the dependence on water and the significant impacts that can be associated with textile manufacture mean water can be a significant threat to the normal functioning of the textile supply chain. This could be due to lack of availability of suitable water sources, but we also note an expectation of growing risk from disruption due to flooding, as climate change raises the risk of both riverine and coastal flooding in many areas. So water is both critical, but also a potential threat to the supply chain and the textile industry overall. So moving on to consider how it might impact business operations. With the majority of the capital sitting in the retail stage of the supply chain, in general, financiers would seem to be sheltered from the water risk that I just sort of touched upon, certainly in a direct sense. But of course, the big apparel brands that they're investing in or they're financing rely on the continued functioning of the supply chain to produce the product, and thus water-related disruption could have a material impact on the sales or margins of the brands that financiers are actually backing. And on this slide, we summarize just some of the ways that could happen, be that through reduced product volumes or in higher costs that are passed through. So given the importance of water to the industry and the potential for risk from water-related disruption, we'd expect it to be a point of concern for both corporates and their investors across the value chain. However, our previous work has shown that the reporting by corporates of water impacts is often limited, and that brings us on to the work we've published in recent weeks. So our latest report is called Exposing Water Risk, and we examine the water-related disclosures of 29 of the leading apparel brands globally to determine to what degree they and their investors are aware of the risk they face from water stress and water-related disruption. In order to assess this, we used a set of keywords related to water risk, for instance, pollution or volume. These keywords were searched for using a natural language processing algorithm, which is proprietary to Planet Tracker. And we looked at close to 3,950 documents across the 27 corporates that we analysed. We categorized the disclosures that we found into low, medium, and high quality, reflecting the number of the kind of key context words we were looking for. So how often, for instance, pollution came up around water. And the documents analysed include things like annual reports, CSR and ESG documents, quarterly reports, and transcripts from investor events. So what did we find? Well, perhaps slightly disappointingly, only 10% of the documents that we searched seem to have any water risk related disclosures. And we found significant variation in the level of discussion of water risk between different corporates, with some mentioning it often, for instance, Caring, LVMH, Gap, Hanes brands, while others seem to barely mention water at all as a threat or risk in any way. And I'd pick out someone like Under Armour or Victoria's Secret as seemingly not talking about water. Now, when we looked at how often we found disclosures, we looked across the period from 2018 to 2022. We actually saw a big rise in the total disclosures from 2,000 to 9,000, which suggests those that are talking about water are talking about it more and more, which is a good thing. When we look at the regional disparities, North America and Europe have similar level of disclosure, and Asian brands seem to lag behind. And I think a really key point is water seemed to come up very rarely at investor events. When we did find it, it tended to be in sustainability reports, very, very rarely found in transcripts from investor events, which perhaps suggests investors are either unaware of water risk or potentially they're very happy with how corporates are managing water, which, given what we'll probably talk about in the rest of the panel, might be more than a little surprising. Now, our report is freely available on our website for anyone who wants to dig into the numbers and our analysis and findings. On the back of our report, our recommendation is really that investors and financiers of apparel brands need to take water much more seriously. They should be factoring water risk into the way that they evaluate their investments. That requires them to have good data on the water use that is happening both directly by the corporates that they're financing, but also in their supply chains. So we call on investors to push company management to disclose this information much more clearly and much more transparently on a publicly available sites, for instance, through CDP. I'm sure Nathan would agree with that point of view. And once data is available, investors can then work with corporates on their, if you like, water transition strategy. They can start to push corporates to take more responsibility for their water impacts, understand their water dependencies, and understand the risk that they're running from the investments that they're making. So with that, I will hand it over to Saba Dar to discuss WWF's work in more detail. Saba, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. My name is Saba Dar, and I work as Manager of Water Stewardship at WWF International. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. So WWF is implementing 5 collective action projects on water stewardship in the textile sector. We are working in 5 different river basins across Asia. One of our projects is in the Büyükmenderes Basin in Turkey. One is in Nile Bhavani River basins in India. Then we're also working in the Indus Basin in Pakistan, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and Taihu Basin in China. Most of these projects are focused on engaging suppliers, tier 2 suppliers of the textile sector, and improving their water energy efficiency. But some of these programs, such as the one in Turkey and in India, they also focus on landscape approach. That is, in addition to engaging with suppliers, we are also working on different environmental components, such as wetland conservation and species conservation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before diving into the details of each of our programs, I just want to give you a sense of what our projects entails and what are the different components that goes into these programs. Most of our programs are basket funding projects, which means that we are working with a variety of our textile corporate partners who are financially supporting these initiatives. We, as I mentioned before, that we engage suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, because water has a very high dependency and also impact within the textile sector within wet processing units. So we help suppliers to improve their water energy efficiency. We also focus on developing a business case to demonstrate that improving your resource efficiency is not only important for the conservation, but it also makes a lot of economic sense. In all of the countries that we are working in, we have established multi-stakeholder platforms because these platforms are very important for bringing together stakeholders from different sectors and to ignite discussions around sustainable water management. We also work on green finance to improve access to finance for suppliers so that they can invest on cleaner production. As I mentioned before, that we are also implementing landscape approach. And finally, we take all our learnings from different projects and lobby for better policies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start off with our first project that is in the Büyükmenderes Basin in Turkey. This basin has a very high ecological significance. It is located in the southwestern part of the country, and it is a very beautiful and touristy place. But in addition to its ecological significance, it has a very high economic significance for the country. As you can see that around 14% of national cotton production takes place within this basin, and also 60% of national home textile exports in Turkey originates from this basin. And if you look at this map, at the upstream, you'll see that there is a province known as Uşak, where most of the leather production takes place. Then if you go downstream, in the middle part, there is the province of Denizli, where most of the dye houses and wet processing units are located. And if you go downstream, most of the cotton production takes place there. So all of this, industrial and agricultural sectors, they are producing impacts in water. Next slide, please. So our program in Turkey focuses on three broad objectives. One is implementation of cleaner production in the textile sector to mitigate environmental impacts. The other one is promoting modern irrigation and regenerative agriculture in cotton production. And finally is the restoration of ecosystem services. Our overall goal in Turkey is to protect freshwater ecosystems and key biodiversity areas, and also to reduce resource use in industrial and agricultural production. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are some of the progress and achievements that we have made till date. We have worked directly with dye houses and helped them achieve water energy savings, which helped us in the development of a business case. We used that business case to mobilize the public sector, and the public government launched a project to conduct 40 feasibility assessment in 40 textile dye houses within the basin. And what is even better is that the government is also responsible for covering half of the cost of the implementation on cleaner production. We also launched a multi-stakeholder platform known as SOKE Cotton Water Stewardship Committee. SOKE is the region within the basin where most of the cotton is produced. And this committee is dedicated to promoting modern irrigation within the basin. Because in this basin, still old methods of irrigation are being used, such as flood irrigation. So WWF Turkey's team is advocating for modern irrigation methods, such as drip irrigation, to promote water efficiency. And finally, we are piloting regenerative cotton farming on over 7 hectares of better cotton farm fields. And we have also developed a regenerative scorecard, which provides a framework to brands as well as to farmers to verify the level of regenerative implementation they are doing on ground. Since currently there's no particular framework for regenerative agriculture, so this scorecard helps brands and farmers to understand the level of regenerative implementation that is happening on ground. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next program that I want to talk about is on Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Most of us are aware that Mekong Delta is home to one of the world's richest biodiversity hotspots, and it also supports the most fertile farmland areas. However, within the past couple of years, Mekong Delta has been confronted with myriad challenges because of hydropower development, because of climate change. There has been a rise in the sea level, and due to overexploitation of water by industrial and agricultural sectors, and due to pollution, the quality of water is also degrading. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our program in the Mekong Delta focuses on raising awareness of suppliers to improve their resource efficiency and also to reduce pollution. We also work with financial institutions and banks to increase access to green financing options. And we use our learnings from the ground to identify gaps that are present in local laws and policies and advocate for better policies. And overall, we are working towards achieving better governance within the river basin. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as you can see that we have achieved significant water energy savings in the basin. We have also provided capacity building workshops to over 150 factories and disseminated knowledge on water risks to over 700 facilities. In addition to that, we have developed multiple guidance materials for the textile sector to improve resource efficiency on green credit, etc. We also worked with a local leasing company, which resulted in the development of a dedicated green credit line, which provides loans to local SMEs at lower interest rates. We are also working with VITAS, which is the Textile Association in Vietnam, and we are leveraging their multi-stakeholder platform, which is known as Sustainability Committee, to help companies, local and international, to commit to better environmental practices such as reducing their water use by 20% and energy use by 15%. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next project that I want to talk about is Noel Bhavani River basins, which originate from mountains of Western Ghats, and they are considered as one of the world's 10 hottest biodiversity hotspots. This basin is also a very important basin economically for India, because 90% of cotton network exports from India actually originate from this basin. However, due to industrial and agricultural production, this basin is experiencing issues of overexploitation of water and also of pollution. And there is overall catchment degradation happening. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in India, we have engaged over 50 factories. We have given them customized plans and identified gaps that exist in their water and energy efficiency. We are also working with farmers, mostly those who are growing coconuts and bananas, because there's no cotton production within the basin, and helping them to improve and implement better management practices. We are also working on conservation of key wetlands within the basin. We have also developed an environmental flows framework. For those who don't know, E-flows is the minimum amount of water that is needed to support biodiversity, and it is extremely critical for river basins where there is hydropower development. So because there is a hydropower dam within these basins, our team has developed an E-flow framework, and now it is advocating for the government to approve these E-flows. We're also working on the removal of invasive species. Our team in India did a research study and found out that invasive species extract more water from the atmosphere as compared to native species. So now we are working with the local forest department to remove all the invasive species and to replace them with native species. And finally, we are working on making integrated water management plans with the local government. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next program I want to talk about is the Indo River Basin in Pakistan. Because Pakistan has only one basin, so the reliance and dependence on this river basin is huge, and it also supports key industrial and agricultural sectors. Like other basins that I've mentioned, this basin is also experiencing challenges of overexploitation, pollution, and fragmented governance. Next slide, please. In this basin, we have worked extensively with over 100 tier 2 suppliers and have given them water energy management plans and helping them to reduce their toxic effluents. We've also given capacity building workshops to many of these suppliers. In addition to that, we are also working on implementing Alliance for Water Stewardship standards. We are also implementing nature-based solutions in this basin, which includes installation of rainwater harvesting systems, recharge wells, etc., and also working on wetland conservation and management. We have developed multiple multi-stakeholder platforms throughout the country in different cities where textile clusters are available. And we're also working very closely with local governments and provincial governments and providing them with policy guidance. I think I will stop there, and I will now hand over to Nathan Cole to present his work on CDP. Thank you.
Thanks, Saba, and thanks, Richard, for having me here today. Delighted to talk a little bit further about CDP's work on water security, and I've got some good intel coming out of our latest report due to launch next month. Some intel around the textiles we'll come on to in the Q&A as well. But just to bring it back to basics for CDP, if we go on to the next slide, hopefully you're all familiar with us by now, but just in case you haven't received one of our requests to disclose, or come across us in some other format, CDP is an international not-for-profit organization we work to secure a thriving economy for people and planet for the long term. And in doing so, we task companies with responding to quite a detailed questionnaire, set of questions based on their environmental impacts. And the notion is by asking the right questions and getting the right information out of those companies responding, we can help drive them forward to the better future we all want to see, whether that's climate change, water security, no further deforestation, biodiversity, and much more. To do this, we focus investors, companies, and cities on taking that urgent action, and we really lean on the financial services companies and investors to really drive that request forward and make that need to provide the information known and to really drive that impact. Secondarily, we also really lean on customers and their supply chain to drive that action and cascade those behaviors through their own supply chain as well. Next slide, please. So just a little bit further on that piece, as you can see here. So in terms of how does it all work? So you either have one of these two types of request, typically an investor request. You have been deemed as having a material impact on that issue by the investor community, or you receive a supply chain request. A company you're working with has deemed that you may have a material impact on their own impacts. And therefore, as Richard's already highlighted, actually the importance of supply chain action on this particular issue here, they feel they need to engage you to provide information so that you can help them in reducing their own impacts. If you receive requests from channels, of course, you become a disclosing company and you may be requested on, typically to date, that was climate change, water security, and forests questionnaires individually, depending on where those impacts lie. Following on from that, of course, you meet that disclosure request and you go through that framework of action, elaborating what do your impacts, your plans, any targets, and I'll come on to this a little bit later in more detail as well, but really elaborating what does your business impact look like across the board for the areas we're looking into there. So crucially for water security, really focusing in on the impact, dependencies, risks, opportunities, actions, just the same as we do on climate change and deforestation. Then, of course, we are really data focused here at CDP. It's not just about getting the information in. We then turn that information back around and really try and develop not only the questionnaire, but also inform those investor and supply chain requests more effectively by the data and insight that comes back. So really important to provide those benchmarks, insights, whatever the case may be. And I'll come on to some of those insights coming out of our latest global water report very shortly. But as you can see, just before I move on from this slide, some real power in those two requests, 136 trillion in investor assets calling on those investor requested companies to respond, and 6.4 trillion in purchasing power coming from those customers requesting their supply chain to engage in this exercise and disclose. Throughout all of this, of course, we do the CDP scoring level, which helps companies understand, okay, yes, I may have these impacts here, I may have this certain behavior, but how do I move forward? And how do I use this framework as a framework for action as well, for developing my own strategy? And we use our scoring to incentivize the right behaviors and drive companies to best practice and ultimately to becoming leaders in their sector. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more on the water questionnaire itself then. Really, we've got a dual purpose here, of course, when providing these questions. Of course, we want to get that business relevant water-related data out. We need that in that standardized, comparable format to make sure that that data is decision useful. Going back to the previous slide, of course, we have those investors requesting that information so they can critically assess that company behavior and make the right decisions based on the right information being provided through to them. That is really key, and just as key for the supply chain side as well, when customers are assessing their suppliers and understanding where to make those business decisions. Of course, it's really helpful for the companies disclosing as well to understand how to move forward once again. Secondarily, but by no means less important, we're looking to catalyze action. within the responding entity, spark those strategic dialogues on water that may not have happened otherwise, and really trying to elevate the value of water in terms of those discussions. I'm sure many of us on this call have felt it to date. It can be climate first, and then that nature piece. But as we all know, the science says there cannot be that climate action or that resolution without taking that more holistic view. And realistically, there is no nature without the climate. So it was a false dichotomy to begin with. And really just trying to put water front and center of those conversations with those investors, and really making that case that we cannot do this in silo and we cannot tackle these as individual issue areas, making sure it's front and center of all those conversations. And then lastly, on my final slide here, just quickly, 2023 in review. And again, I'll come into some more detailed stats here and a little bit more on the textiles once we get into the discussion. But we had nearly 13,356 high impact companies asked to provide water related data via CDP. From that, we had 4,815 responding. So a huge number of companies responding. Big uplift, 23% from 2022, 90% increase from the last 10 years. But of course, we need to see a lot more. And if we're asking that 13,000 to respond, it's because they have impacts. So there's some 9,000 who are failing to meet that request. We still have gaps, and we need to do more to drive that disclosure and get those companies providing that decision useful data so we can better understand the landscape. And that's really key, and nonetheless more important when it comes to textiles as well, as we've already heard, the dependencies, the interlinking of issues, and that really pivotal piece around the supply chain is all the more critical. And we'll come on to some more of those textiles specific stats in a moment, but I will stop there and we can move through into the discussion portion of the conversation today.
Thank you, Nathan and Saba. With that, I've stopped sharing the slides and we'll move to the panel discussion. And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. That's not the chat function, and I will endeavour to include those in our discussion. Now, to provide a framework for this discussion, we're going to move through 3 high-level areas. We're going to start with risks and impacts of water, move on to disclosure, and finally action. So starting with the risks and impact, if I can start with you, Saba, by asking what are the major water risks and impacts that the supply chain are facing and what are you finding in your work in that area?
Thank you, Richard. I think we've already talked about textile sector's dependencies and impacts, so I will not go very deep into it. However, I will briefly mention, just for some context, that there are 3 main types of water risks: physical water risks, reputational, and regulatory risks. And I will be focusing more on physical water risks. There are 3 types of physical water risks. One is of water quantity, where the water can either be too little, that is water scarcity, or too much, that is flooding. The other type of water risk is water quality, which refers to how clean the water is. And the last type is ecosystem services status. Now, ecosystems provide us with a wide range of goods and services, and once they're degraded, they can result in limited access to clean water and also disruptions in supply chains. If you look at the textile sector, it is usually concentrated in large clusters around the world in countries like Bangladesh, Brazil, Pakistan, India, China, Vietnam, US, and a couple of other countries. And most of these clusters are actually exposed to very high physical water risks. In 2016, World Bank published a study that showed that the growth in key apparel countries such as Pakistan, India, and China is expected to decrease by 6% due to different water-related impacts. In addition to this, WWF published a report back in 2022 in collaboration with the Open Supply Hub to highlight water risks and opportunities that exist for the textile sector. For this report, WWF used its flagship tool known as Water Risk Filter to identify physical water risks for the year 2020 and used it as a baseline to assess how these risks will evolve by 2050, accounting for climate change and also for socioeconomic conditions. Now, our findings were interesting, but also a little worrying. For most of the largest industrial clusters in the world, the physical water risks are going to increase from medium to high risk by 2050. Now, this will have serious implications for the textile sector, from increasing the cost of production to more stringent regulations, and in worst case scenarios, even the disruptions of whole supply chain. One more important message that the report flagged was that even though water scarcity is a very significant risk across the board, and we've seen in the last couple of years how most parts of Europe have been experiencing drought, however, for the textile sector particularly, the two key risks are that of flooding and water quality, both in terms of severity and their prevalence. And these risks will continue to amplify due to climate change, as we've already seen in the super floods that struck Pakistan back in 2022. The report also highlighted that by 2050, there's a strong likelihood that 3 out of every 4 textile suppliers will face the risk of water quality. So these are some of the risks that the textile sector is faced with, and we are already seeing the impacts of these on ground. For instance, one of the suppliers that we work with in Vietnam shared with us that because the Ho Chi Minh City is prone to floods and storms, they have actually experienced damages to the buildings of their facilities, and even their machinery and government goods were also flooded. But the biggest impact that they felt was on their labor force and the loss of productivity that came with it. Similarly, in the Vietnam Basin where we are working, the government had to limit irrigation from 4 times a year to 2 times because the basin was experiencing water scarcity due to less rainfall back in 2021, which had farmers really upset about the yield. So these are some of the impacts, some examples that we are already seeing. However, I would like to note here that water is a local challenge. So the impacts of different types of water risks and the way we respond to them will very much depend on the local context. However, there are a lot of opportunities for companies right now to invest on solutions such as nature-based solutions, on protection and restoration of wetlands, which can mitigate these risks and also the impacts that they create.
Thank you, Saba. That's really interesting. I mean, Nathan, taking on from that, you've mentioned the report that CDP has been working on the analysis. I'd be interested to know sort of what you're seeing in terms of impacts and risk, and that's going to coming out of the report you're doing at the moment or have been working on.
Yeah, absolutely, and I must say it's a pretty similar picture to as Saba's described there in terms of a lot of that landscape. So we've got our global water report coming out on the 22nd of March. Look out for it. It's a really fascinating look into the risks companies are reporting within their supply chain. This is across the water piece, but I'll focus in on textiles in a second. You know, how are we engaging those suppliers to reduce those risks, impacts, dependencies? So really fantastic. Look out for that publication. It'll really dive into this in full detail. But to give a bit of a flavor, of course, as we've already heard on a number of occasions, absolutely, the CDP data is showing exactly what we've said here. The majority of the risks in the textile sector, they're embedded in the supply chain. The apparel industry in particular is kind of the second largest reporter of supply chain risks, and the majority of those are, as Sab has rightly described, physical water risks, water stress, drought, pollution, unreliable rainfall patterns, floods, etc. So really, I think quite a typical to be expected perhaps from the apparel industry. But really interestingly, we had 19 companies reporting water risks in their supply chain that could have a significant impact on their business, including Adidas, Hermes International, carrying LVMH and Levi Strauss, totaling around $925 million in potential financial impact. So there's a huge amount at stake here, even just from those 19 companies alone reporting those risks, 925 million across 19 companies. There's a huge amount at stake. And actually one thing our report does highlight is that actually the cost to mitigate these risks and to avoid some of that cost, future cost is actually far lower than ignoring these risks. So the cost of taking action is actually far lower than the cost of inaction. Yet we're still trying to wake companies up to the challenge of these supply chain risks and get that action catalyzed. So it's a really challenging piece. And I think that the crux of it comes in here. So only 54%, sorry, of companies in the textiles area here were including supply chain in their risk assessment. That was above average compared to the entire water sample, but still only around half of them incorporating this crucial piece of the puzzle. We've also found that including suppliers in that water risk assessment leads most companies to identify 7 times more risk. So clearly these risk assessments are really pivotal in unlocking the challenge and demystifying where these water-related risks lie. And Richard, to the point you were making earlier, I think this goes a long way in describing the lack of mentions of water risk that you were flagging here, because companies simply aren't looking for it. And they really need to, widen that lens and incorporate this really crucial piece of the puzzle. And I've had a number of conversations on the ground with companies who just haven't quite got to that point there. It's in your supply chain. It's not direct, but it's there, and you need to look further afield into that supply chain. But I don't want to sound too dour and negative there. There's a lot of exciting opportunities for companies here, to really catalyze action and drive forward in the right way, increasing resilience and opening the door to financial rewards. So it's not as bleak as it may sound. And again, that cost of inaction versus action is really quite pivotal here. I'll just finish lastly, in our last year's report, we found that 55% of respondents in the sector reported opportunities which could have a significant impact on their business. For those companies, acting on water were opportunities to increase brand value, boost competitive advantage, improve customer satisfaction, enhance climate resilience across agricultural supply chains, and a lot more when you get down into those squiggly ends of the details too. But there's a huge amount of value to be realized there. And I think that the real key is unlocking that risk assessment and just widening that lens, because clearly there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing for a lot of companies. But I will stop there for the sake of time.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I think it's a nice segue from risk and towards the disclosure part of the conversation we want to have. And we've actually had a question in just before we dig into that on the data that you presented in your presentation, Nathan, around the 4.8 thousand companies. Just a split of those between the financial institutions and the corporates that you were pointing to as potential disclosures.
In that one, it should be quite a minimal number, because here we're talking about the main overall water security questionnaire. If the asker is who I believe it may be, you will know well, we introduced our water and forest module for financial services companies. So that focuses a little bit more on the portfolio side of things rather than that direct operational impact. That's where financial services will find the majority of their impacts on water insecurity or deforestation. So CDP gave a very tailored approach there called the Financial Services Forest and Water module. So that vast majority of that 4.8 thousand will be non-financial services companies. There will be a handful who did still submit those full questionnaires, but by and large, we want to focus the financial services companies predominantly on that specific module that focuses on the portfolio impact rather than the operational impact.
Thank you. And if I could stay with you, Nathan, and I mean, you touched on there about some of the corporates that have responded and the size of the impact that they're talking about, but I guess, have you heard much from those maybe who haven't or have partially disclosed as to the challenges that they're finding with actually answering your questions?
Yeah, and I'm under no illusions. Anyone who's had to submit CDP will know it is a challenge, but we think it's a worthwhile challenge in asking the right questions. But it is a really tall order, and especially for companies where we're saying focus on your supply chain, figure out the supply chain side. It's far more challenging than that direct operational piece where you have that far more greater control, greater visibility of exactly what's happening. The only thing I can really say there is that information is key and information is your friend here. We do a lot of work in the supply chain program I was just working on previously to becoming our head of sustainable business, driving companies to get that information out of their supply chain. And I think it comes back to that old adage we hang our hat on at CDP: you can't manage what you don't measure. And another one that we seem to be using a lot as well: don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. It is a simple case of, you've got to get get started, and you've got to start measuring some data. Use the CDP questionnaire, use that framework to guide that action. Take what you need to understand about your suppliers, take what you don't, take what you need about your direct operations, but use that as a catalyst to drive the sustainable business practices you need to see.
Thank you. And of course, it's very hard for an apparel brand to provide data if they can't really get the data from the supply chain. So moving to you, Saba, I'd just be really interested to sort of have almost the same question. What are the challenges you're hearing from supply chain actors you're working with about getting quality water reporting data and passing that to the brands that they work with or the investors of those brands, whoever it might be?
Thank you, Richard. As you already mentioned yourself, that water hasn't really been high on priority for most of the companies. And WW's main focus has been on driving implementation and action on ground. So reporting is sort of a side product for us, the action that we are delivering, what kind of savings or results we are getting. However, in the recent past, we have seen some progress. The companies are now moving towards developing water strategies and setting water targets, which has encouraged them to engage with the suppliers and ask for data on water savings so that they can align it with their targets. However, there are still a lot of challenges because I feel like the textile sector is still new to this space. And some of those challenges around reporting sometimes differ regionally. So the first challenge that we have observed while working with suppliers is the lack of monitoring of water use. Sometimes it gets really challenging to access consistent data on water use from suppliers. Now the process of collection of the data itself is not very complicated. If you can install water meters and get data from it, but because it is not on the priority of suppliers, and also because sometimes they don't have water meters, we're not able to get this kind of data. Sometimes suppliers also need consultation to set up good water monitoring systems. The other challenge that we've heard from suppliers is around their frustration around reporting on similar KPI status indicators, but in different reporting formats, because different companies have different reporting structures. So they ask for similar data, but the structure is different. So it creates a lot of workload for suppliers. In addition to that, we've heard that the asks and guidelines on water use and water efficiency also change very frequently from the buyer's end, which becomes very hard for suppliers to adapt to those changes. So I feel like in that space, there is a need to standardize asks and guidelines on one hand and also reporting on the other hand. The third challenge is around the validity and accuracy of the data itself, because most of the water data is being collected through self-reporting tools and frameworks. For instance, many companies ask their suppliers to report data through Sustainable Apparel Coalition's HIG tool, HIG FEM, Facility Environment Module. But because suppliers and companies both have a very limited understanding of what constitutes a good water data, the data is not always reliable. For instance, what we've heard is that most of the data that is captured in different frameworks only focuses on water use within the processes. However, when you are in a facility, water is being used in utilities, it is also being used for domestic purposes. So that data is not usually accounted for. So reliability is a big challenge of the data. Another challenge, which is kind of an extension of the validity of the data challenge, is that because no company has mapped its supply chain all the way from the farm to the finished product. So this lack of traceability and visibility translates into an incomplete picture of how water is being extracted, how it's being used, tracked, and even reported. So the industry as a whole needs to address this issue because it's a very big issue. So these are just, briefly a few challenges that we've seen with the suppliers.
Thank you. And I'd like to pick up on, I think it was the second of your three there, but certainly something I hear from my interactions with the supply chain is that challenge of being asked to provide the same data in subtly different fashions by different brands that you're working with. And there's a question that's come in from the audience. It's actually for Nathan about CDP. You've got your water questionnaire, but it's not by no means the only questionnaire out there asking for the detail. So the question is really, how are you looking to work with the likes of the TNFD, with Ceres and their valuing water initiatives? How are we looking to standardize at the high level how water data is disclosed, and therefore that will then hopefully flow down the supply chain, if you excuse the pun.
No, absolutely, and love the phrasing. I think it's a really important question, and for CDP, it is front and center of our mind. Um, I was called a megalomaniac the last time I said this, but in an ideal world for me, being at CDP, we just have one solo disclosure framework and everyone would respond to CDP and it would simplify everything for everyone. Now, of course, we don't live in that perfect world. And I think for CDP, front and center of our mind is this alignment piece. I'm sure the audience are already sick to death of the favorite buzzword of the moment being interoperability. And that is front and center for us, making sure those standards speak to each other. So CDP is on a mission at the moment to integrate ISSB Schedule 2, TNFD, and some of the mandatory disclosure regulation coming out of the EU, CSRD, ESRS as well. Those are front and center of our mind. And, for us to, really assist and to, live by what we're trying to achieve here at CDP, we really need to take those standards, translate them through the CDP machine, give you those structured questions so you can respond in a standardized format so that it doesn't come back in, a wall of text that's different for every company, but you turn these pillars into something very actionable and standardized and something that then adds that progressibility, that best practice lens to the mix as well through CDP scoring. When TCFD was introduced in 2019, we found actually that 69% of CDP respondents to the climate change questionnaire were already meeting all or most of these TCFD recommended aligned disclosures because we were already asking them, what does your governance look like? What is your risk exposure, etc. So we are really, really focused on that piece. And of course, TNFD is a really big focus for us coming up now to make sure we bring all of that in. Of course, looking across at ESRS, at ISSB, any of those other elements that we need to bring in as well on this water and nature piece. It's going to be really pivotal for us. And rest assured, it is a big focus for us. How can we streamline this reporting? And, we've seen some great successes on that front as well. If anyone in the room is an RE100 member and reports fully to CDP, you no longer have to send a manual Excel spreadsheet through to RE100 because that reporting's all met through RE100. Now, me personally, I'd love to see a lot more of that, but of course, CDP can do our part, which is, taking those steps, having those dialogues and making sure we align with the market and everything that's coming across the hill.
Thank you. And I think that's a nice movement to take us into the sort of action phase in the final sort of 10 minutes and a bit of the webinar that we have. We've had a question around a digital product passport and whether or not you think that, and I guess that's a great example of the idea of technology providing a way of tracking all the way through supply chains and therefore maybe standardizing data. So maybe Saba, I don't know if you want to comment as to, are you hearing the supply chain talking a lot about technology being a great answer here, or do they just not really have the means to invest in a lot of this, the potential that they might bring?
So we work with SMEs of different levels of maturity. Some of them are really advanced, which are directly working with international companies, and some are just working locally. So I feel like those who are working with international companies, they are probably ready for using more and more technology in their processes. But as you mentioned, investment is the biggest challenge, and we need to provide them with access to investment so that they can move more towards the digital options.
And I mean, just another question came in focused on your work in Turkey, asking how difficult it's been to attract investment, and is it brands and retailers funding your work there? And if so, who are they? Are they publicly known, or is this sort of quite a private initiative?
Yes, no, they're publicly known. So there are brands like Tommy Hilfiger, IKEA, and Gina Tricot, and a couple of other brands who have just wrapped up their partnership with us. So Turkey is a place of interest for most of the brands because they're very close to Europe, and a lot of European brands have their supply chains in Turkey. Particularly the work that we are doing on regenerative agriculture, it attracts a lot of attention. A lot of brands are now interested in working on regenerative cotton. So I would say that when we started out this work initially, of course, attracting investment was a challenge, but now we are at a point where a lot of companies are willing to work with us. But the challenge that we face is that sometimes they're only interested in working on the cotton aspect and not interested in supporting the entire project. And our focus is on the entire project, that is the water component has to be supported. The other thing is the sustainability of this support, because most of the brands that work with us, the partnership is for 2 or 3 years, and after, once that wrap up and the companies are able to achieve their targets, that partnership comes to an end. So the sustainability is a question here, and we are still working and trying to understand how we can answer this question of sustainability, long-term sustainability of these initiatives.
So I guess if I could lead on from that and say, what needs to change? What do you and what would you think is best practice from major apparel brands when it comes to engaging with the supply chain on water? I mean, obviously you'd say work with WWF and provide funding to your programs, but more broadly, what are we looking at here? We obviously need investment. Is it risk sharing on some of these projects? Is it a different framework? Is it regulation? What do you think needs to change?
So what we need to do is overhaul the way we've been operating within the textile sector. And through our work with tier 2 suppliers, one thing that has come up very frequently is the lack of provision of long-term purchase agreements to suppliers, because currently there's no market differentiation for suppliers who are becoming more water efficient or who are committed to becoming better water stewards as compared to those who are doing nothing. Right. So they need to have extra incentive for companies, which can come in the form of long-term purchase agreements. On the other hand, in most of the manufacturing countries, the government does not provide any subsidies or tax abatements for implementation of intervention. So this lack of incentive, both from the company side and from the government side, is one of the major challenges in scaling the implementation of cleaner production. So one of the best practices would be to provide those incentives to suppliers. One more thing to add here is that some of the textile facilities, particularly in countries like India and Vietnam, they're not even operating at their maximum capacity due to various local reasons. So their focus is on their business growth instead of mitigation of risk. So they need extra support and they need incentives to do more on water. And here I would like to quote an example that I mentioned when I was presenting our case in Turkey, that we developed a business case for the Büyük Menderes Basin and mobilized the public sector. And the government responded very positively to it, because textile sector is a priority sector for the government in Turkey. And they launched a government which is not only covering gap analysis studies for the suppliers, but they're also going to cover half of the cost of the implementation of interventions. So this is the kind of support we need from the government sector and for companies. The other thing companies can do is they can incorporate sustainability criteria into their procurement decisions, which will give the suppliers who are already doing better on water an extra edge in the market. The companies should also provide formal and informal trainings on water, which can range from simply an awareness session on water risks that a particular basin is facing to more technical sessions. A company can also provide direct loans to its suppliers, which are just solely for the upgradation of water management systems. And as Nathan mentioned earlier, that the cost of inaction is actually higher than cost of action. So them giving these loans would, in the long term, would be beneficial for the company itself. One thing that I mentioned before, that because of this inconsistency in reporting guidelines, etc., we need to have standardization across the sector.
That was really interesting, and I think moving to you, Nathan, and the idea of action, there's a question around how do you get, and the term has been used by the questionnaire, is unethical retailers to start reporting on the risks and their impacts, or indeed to start working with the likes of Saba. I mean, if they're focused purely on cutting cost, what is the selling point to providing data here and being more transparent?
I mean, it's a really difficult one, because at the end of the day, a bad actor could just choose to act poorly and continue down that track. And, there's not necessarily any system of control for that, regrettably, unless we go to the governments and them introducing, more stringent regulations and requiring it of them legally. Now, in the lack of those kind of structures, we at CDP, we lean on our investor request, our customer request, and getting those pressures from that side of things, which we've done really fantastically well to date. getting, and again, perhaps it comes back to that question of the supply chain. If the suppliers or the customers of Shein suddenly start to demand this more frequently, then all of a sudden that pressure changes and the company is no longer able to act in the way that it's been allowed to act to date, because they operate on the social license of being able to sell their products. And if that goes away and the audience suddenly changes, then fantastic. Now, of course, that wider customer base individually buying products might not ever reach that crystallizing moment. But what we can have is those other members higher up the supply chain, in the value chain, demanding that behavior of them. You are part of my supply chain. You need to take these actions. I'd also like to see more focus coming from the investor community to drive this action as well. Perhaps, again, we have that very climate-focused approach in a lot of cases, and I think moving away from that siloed action and really driving companies across the whole piece. I think we need to incorporate more of these water metrics and start calling out these bad actors more stringently to drive the behaviors we need to see. Unfortunately, that's not the firmest answer, but I go back to that first point of, realistically, if you've got a bad actor, the only thing that really ever reins in a bad actor fully is the law and legislation, which is why CDP never ceases its efforts to drive things like mandatory disclosure, better global standards, and things like that, because you can't just lean on these customer stakeholder pressures. You need to have that whole combination. I think it goes back to a point Saba was making. It really is that whole piece of the government regulation, the societal pressures, the supply chain, the value chain driving the action, and the investor community underpinning it all. As I say, that's not a golden bullet, and I think it's a really great question. I wish I had the answer to that, and I wish we could correct their behavior right now and resolve all of those impacts. But I think it's unfortunately it's very incremental, and we need to keep ratcheting up those pressures over time.
Thank you. And I mean, from a Planet Tracker point of view, I'd echo that. I think investors can be a very important driver here to holding the corporate feet to the fire, if you will, and it requires them to be aware of what's going on. And nature is more complicated than climate. I think that's probably pretty fair. It's harder to measure and understand, and water would be part of that, but it's something that can be done if we all make an effort together. So with the last few minutes, I'm going to ask a final question, really around, it touches on this unethical company question to some extent, which is, do the panelists, or either of you, Nathan and Saba, believe that the companies that you've interacted with don't understand their exposure to water? I mean, it would be very surprising and arguably negligent if they're not aware of this to some extent. But is it just that they're just choosing not to disclose? So is this something where it's just a complete lack of awareness, or is this a willful blindness? And maybe I'll start with you, Saba.
As I mentioned before, that the things are changing now. So WWF has developed this tool known as Water Risk Filter. So a lot of our partnerships start with risk assessment. We help companies understand where their dependencies and impacts lie, and where are the most impactful dependencies lie within their supply chain. We then prioritize those areas and then focus action on them. So I would say that companies who have started working with us, especially through Water Risk Filter and then towards the implementation, now they have a better understanding. And there are other tools out there which a lot of companies are using in addition to WWF's tools. So I would say that bigger actors in the market, they do have a better understanding of their water risk. But yes, the smaller brands, probably they're still far away from understanding what their water risks are and where their impacts usually lie.
And excuse me, Nathan, if I could pass to you to finish off, what's your view from a sort of CDP viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, not to get too meta with it, but I might query, what do you mean when you say, do you think they understand? Because going back to that differentiation you started to offer there, Richard, they might be aware that there are some impacts. It's inherent, of course, with textiles. We can't not have an impact. Does that mean they know what their actual impacts are, where they're located, what those actual impacts are, the financial values, the cost to mitigate that risk versus the cost of seeing that risk through? CDP data would suggest probably not, or we'd be seeing a lot more action, because again, that we have the numbers, watch out for the reports, that cost of inaction, it genuinely is higher, and it's self-reported data from the companies who are taking that action and waking up to the challenge. I've had a number of conversations in my time working directly with the companies as well. We, really focused on the climate challenge, and we keep saying, you've got to focus on water as well. And we don't have any water impact. So yes, I've genuinely had those conversations with big, large listed UK PLC who said, we don't see that. And we had to be like, no, it's in the supply chain. Please expand that risk assessment. I think Saba makes a really valid point, though. It all ultimately comes back to that appetite from the board, from the leadership, and what is priority, what is a material issue to us. And for better or worse, I have had conversations with companies in recent years where they say that's not a material issue to us. So again, I think it is showing a lack of understanding, because I think if they fully understood that risk, the cost to mitigate it, the cost to the planet of not addressing it, and they took that long-term view, I think we'd see a very different picture of water-related action. So yeah, I go back to that point. I don't think, yes, they may be aware, but I don't think they understand or fully appreciate what that exposure looks like or what it would take to address it. So at its core, I'm sticking to my guns and saying, no, I don't think most companies do fully understand their impact on water.
Brilliant. Thank you. A really fascinating final point to end on there, and certainly gives us a lot of work suggestions to needs to carry on in this sector. I'd say thank you to Saba Dar, and thank you to Nathan Cole for being on the panel. Thank you to everyone who's been attending. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. We're more than happy to follow up with more from any of our panelists, I'm sure. And with that, I will say good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be in the world, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.